The winter of 1883 came down on the Dakota prairie like a hammer. It was not a gentle season that eased its way into the bones of the land, but a sudden, violent arrival. The sky, which had been a brilliant, hopeful blue in late October, turned to a flat, unforgiving slate gray overnight. The wind followed, a constant presence that did not howl so much as it ground against the thin wooden walls of the settlers' cabins. It found every crack, every chink in the mortar, every gap beneath a door, and poured through like a thief come to steal the very heat from a man's blood. The cold did not knock before it entered. It was simply there, an occupant more permanent than the people who had built the homes. For the small, hopeful community of Providence Creek, this was the third such winter, and it was already promising to be the worst. They were people of grit and determination, having left behind lives in the East for the promise of 160 acres of their own. They knew hardship. They understood the language of aching backs and calloused hands. But this cold was a different kind of adversary. It was a silent, suffocating pressure that demanded a constant, losing battle. The currency of this war was wood. Every day was a frantic calculation of fuel. A man would rise before dawn, his breath a cloud in his own bedroom, and his first thought would be of the stove. The cast-iron stove was the heart of every home, a squat, black idol that demanded ceaseless tribute. Men spent their days in the dwindling stands of cottonwood down by the creek, the rhythmic thud of their axes, a desperate prayer against the encroaching frost. The wood they brought back was never enough. It was often green and burned with a sullen, smoky reluctance. The stoves roared, devouring cord after cord, their metal sides glowing a dangerous cherry red. Yet the heat they produced was a fleeting, aggressive thing. It scorched the air in a small circle around the stove, leaving the corners of the room in the grip of a profound chill. Frost bloomed on the inside of the window panes, intricate, beautiful patterns of death for the warmth within. Families lived their lives in a shrinking radius around the fire. Children were forbidden from playing on the far side of the room. Meals were eaten in a hurry, before the food could turn cold on the plate. At night, families would sleep piled together under every blanket and quilt they owned, only to wake to a house as cold as a tomb, the fire having died hours before. This was the reality for everyone. It was the accepted, miserable truth of life on the prairie. They fought the cold with the only weapon they knew: more fire, more wood, a bigger blaze in the belly of the iron beast. It was a strategy of brute force, and it was failing. Among them lived a man named Elias. He was quieter than most, a widower who had arrived 2 years prior with his young daughter, Anna. He was an outsider, not by any deliberate act of exclusion from the community, but by the nature of his own reserved spirit and his accent, which carried the gentle, melodic cadence of a land far across the ocean. He had been a stonemason in the old country, a fact the others knew but did not fully understand. To them, masonry was for foundations and chimneys, a rough and functional craft. They could not grasp the artistry or the science he saw in a simple stone. He observed the way the wind scoured the north-facing walls of the cabins. He saw how the heat from the stoves rushed straight up the chimneys, painting a dark, wasteful plume against the gray sky. He felt the drafts that snaked across his own floorboards, chilling his daughter's small feet. He remembered the previous winter, the one that had taken his wife, her cough growing worse in the damp, uneven cold, until her lungs could fight no more. The memory was a cold stone in his own chest, a weight that drove his every thought. That autumn, as the other men were reinforcing their cabins and felling every tree they could reach, Elias began to do something strange. He did not add another layer of sod to his roof. He did not stuff rags into the cracks in his walls. Instead, he took a shovel and began to dig in the center of his small cabin's main room. The other settlers had shallow root cellars, accessible by an outer door, but Elias was digging directly into his living space. He ignored the packed earth floor he had so carefully leveled the year before, and began to excavate a deep, square pit. Silas Blackwood, the closest thing Providence Creek had to a leader, was the first to notice. Silas was a good man, practical and proud, a carpenter who had built half the structures in the settlement. He prided himself on his knowledge of sound construction. He walked over to Elias's cabin one afternoon, drawn by the sight of the growing pile of dirt outside the door. He found Elias waist-deep in the hole, his face streaked with sweat despite the biting air. "Elias," Silas said, his voice laced with a genuine, if condescending, concern. "What in God's name are you doing? An early grave for the winter?" Some of the other men who had followed Silas chuckled. Elias paused, leaning on his shovel. He looked up, his pale blue eyes calm and serious. "I am building a stove," he said, his accent making the words sound peculiar. The men laughed outright this time. A stove was made of iron, bought from a catalog. A stove was not a hole in the ground. "A stove?" Silas scoffed, shaking his head. "You'll burn your house down around your ears, man, or flood it come the spring thaw. You build a fire in a pit in your floor, and you'll have nothing left but ashes. This is foolishness." Elias did not argue. He did not defend himself. He simply said, "The fire will not be in the room." This pronouncement was met with blank stares. It made no sense. How could a fire heat a room if it was not in the room? Seeing their confusion, he tried to explain. He knelt and drew a shape in the dirt with his finger. It was a diagram of channels, of a firebox deep below the floor, and a long, winding path for the smoke to travel through a mass of stone before it reached the chimney. "The heat stays in the stone," he said, pointing to the drawing. "The stone warms the house, a slow heat, a long heat." Silas stared at the drawing as if it were the ramblings of a madman. "Smoke goes up, Elias, not sideways. You'll fill your house with smoke and choke yourself and that little girl to death. This is the prairie, not some old-world fairy tale. We build with wood and iron here. We build what works." He kicked the dirt over the drawing, erasing the strange design. "Stick to what you know, or what we can teach you, before you get yourself killed." He turned and walked away, the other men following, shaking their heads and muttering about the poor, foolish foreigner. The word spread quickly. Elias Brandt, the quiet widower, had finally lost his senses. He was building a suicide stove, a smoke pit that would either suffocate him or burn him alive. The mockery was not always malicious, but it was constant. It was a mixture of pity and derision, the certainty of practical men confronted with an idea so alien it could only be wrong. Elias was undeterred. The laughter and the warnings were like the wind against the walls of his resolve. He knew what he was doing. He was not building from a flight of fancy, but from a memory of stone and heat, from a knowledge passed down through generations of masons who understood that a fire's energy could be tamed, stored, and persuaded to serve man, rather than merely being unleashed. He was building a kachelofen, a masonry heater, but one adapted to the materials of this new world. He did not have glazed tiles, so he would use field stone. He did not have prefabricated iron doors, so he would fashion one himself. He was building a memory of warmth for his daughter, a fortress against the cold that had stolen her mother. His work continued, a lonely and arduous ritual. After digging the pit for the firebox and the main chamber, he began lining it with flat stones, fitting them together with a mason's precision. He then began the back-breaking labor of hauling more stone from the creek bed and the surrounding fields. He did not have a wagon, only a wheelbarrow. Each day he would walk for miles, his eyes scanning the landscape for stones of the right size and shape. He would pry them from the frozen earth, his muscles screaming in protest, and wheel them back to his cabin, one by one. The pile of stones grew, a testament to his silent, unyielding purpose. While he gathered stones, the community bustled with their own preparations. Silas Blackwood was finishing a new cabin for a newly arrived family, its walls perfectly notched, its chimney straight and true. He used the best techniques he knew, the same techniques that had always been used. He packed the walls with moss and mud, ensuring a tight fit. He built a large hearth of river stone, designed to hold a roaring fire. He felt a sense of pride in his work, in its solid, traditional craftsmanship. Every time he passed Elias's claim and saw the man wrestling with another rock, he felt a pang of pity. The poor man was wasting his time, his energy, on a dangerous fantasy, while real work was being done all around him. Elias began mixing his mortar. He did not have lime, so he used what the land offered: clay, dug from a deposit near the creek, mixed with sand and dried prairie grass for a binder. He worked the mixture with his bare hands, the cold mud sucking the warmth from his fingers, until it reached the perfect consistency. Then the true construction began. Down in the pit, he built the firebox, a small, sturdy chamber with a narrow opening. From this box, he began to construct the channels, a labyrinth of stone passages that snaked back and forth under the spot where his floor would be. It was like building a flattened, hollow honeycomb. Each stone was chosen with care, placed with precision, and sealed with the clay mortar. This was the heart of the system, the maze that would force the hot gases from the fire to give up their heat to the surrounding mass before they were allowed to escape. His daughter Anna was his silent shadow. She would sit for hours on her small stool, wrapped in a thick wool shawl, watching her father work. She did not understand the geometry of what he was building, but she understood his focus. She saw the unwavering determination in his eyes. She would bring him water or a piece of bread, her small hand patting his arm in a gesture of simple, profound faith. Her presence was his fuel, a quiet reminder of the stakes. He was not merely building a stove. He was building a shield to protect her from the ghost of the previous winter. While Elias built downward, his neighbors built upward and outward. They stacked their wood piles higher, the neat cords of timber a comforting, if temporary, bastion against the coming siege. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer was constant as he repaired stovepipes and forged new hinges for rattling doors. The women spent their days canning the last of the garden's produce and sewing thicker linings into winter coats. They were all engaged in a flurry of activity, a communal effort based on shared knowledge and shared fear. And through it all, Elias worked alone in his cabin, in his hole, creating something none of them could comprehend. His isolation was complete. He was a man on an island of strange conviction, surrounded by a sea of well-meaning, absolute certainty that he was wrong. By the time the first snows came, dusting the prairie in a thin, deceptive layer of white, the core of Elias's system was complete. A massive, flat block of stone and mortar, filled with intricate channels, now lay just beneath the level of his floor. From the center of this mass, he began to build the chimney, but it was unlike any chimney they had ever seen. It was not a narrow flue of loosely stacked stones, but a thick, solid pillar of masonry, 4 feet square, rising through the center of the cabin. The smoke, he explained to a curious but still skeptical passerby, would travel up through a central channel in this pillar, heating the entire column of stone as it rose. The pillar itself would become a second radiator, a warm heart in the center of the home. He packed earth back into the cabin, burying his creation and leveling the floor around the base of the massive central pillar. He laid down new floorboards, and to any casual observer, the interior of his cabin looked almost normal, save for the enormous brick column that dominated the space. There was no stove. There was no hearth. There was only a small, heavy iron plate set flush with the floor in one corner, with a small handle. This was the door to the firebox below. The strangeness of it was unsettling. A house with no visible source of heat was a house that invited death. The mockery softened into a kind of morbid curiosity. The settlers of Providence Creek were no longer laughing. They were waiting. They were waiting for the deep cold to come, to pass its judgment on the folly of the quiet man and his invisible stove. The judgment was not long in coming. In the second week of December, the hammer fell. A storm, born in the far northern wastes of Canada, descended upon the plains. The locals called it a white hurricane. It began with a wind that carried a new and terrifying edge, a razor-sharp cold that seemed to cut through wool and leather as if they were paper. The sky vanished, replaced by a churning, horizontal torrent of snow. It was not a gentle snowfall, but a blinding, scouring blizzard that reduced visibility to a few feet and piled drifts up to the eaves of the cabins. Then the temperature plummeted. It dropped 10 degrees, then 20, then 30. The mercury in the few thermometers in the settlement shrank to the bottom of the glass and stayed there, useless. It was a cold that was absolute, a physical force that attacked the very integrity of the world. Trees, their sap frozen solid, cracked with a sound like rifle shots. Nails contracted in the wood of the cabins, and the walls groaned in protest. The world outside became an uninhabitable wasteland of white fury and lethal cold. For the families of Providence Creek, the ordeal began. The battle for warmth became a desperate, minute-by-minute struggle. The iron stoves, their only defense, became ravenous monsters. Men wrapped themselves in layers of clothing and made perilous journeys to their woodpiles, fighting through waist-deep drifts, returning with armloads of wood that seemed to vanish into the fire in moments. The stoves glowed red, but their heat was a lie. It could not push back the immense pressure of the cold. Drafts that had been minor annoyances became jets of Arctic air. Water froze in buckets just a few feet from the fire. In Silas Blackwood's well-built cabin, the situation was grim. He had one of the best stoves in the settlement, a large, modern Monarch model he had freighted in from Chicago. He and his wife Mary kept it fed constantly. The stovepipe glowed a dull orange, and the air near it was almost painfully hot. But 10 feet away, the cold ruled. Mary tried to cook, but the batter for her biscuits stiffened in the bowl before she could get it to the oven. Their 2 young sons were bundled in so many blankets they could barely move, their faces pale and pinched. Silas could feel his own creation failing him. He could feel the cold seeping through the walls he had so carefully built, a relentless, victorious enemy. He was burning through his winter wood supply at a terrifying rate. In 2 days of the storm, he had used what should have lasted 2 weeks. Fear, cold and sharp as an icicle, began to form in his gut. They might not have enough fuel to outlast the storm. Other homes were faring even worse. The Larson family, new arrivals in the cabin Silas had just built for them, found that the green wood they had hastily gathered would barely burn. Their cabin was filled with a greasy, choking smoke, but little heat. Their baby cried incessantly, a thin, weak wail of misery. The widow Hemlock, an elderly woman who lived alone, ran out of chopped wood entirely on the second day. She began breaking up her furniture, feeding her chairs and a small table to the hungry stove, her tears freezing on her cheeks. The community, once bound by proximity, was now a collection of isolated, freezing islands, each fighting a losing war. The very air seemed to be freezing solid, a clear, crystalline predator. Meanwhile, in Elias Brandt's cabin, a different reality was unfolding. On the first morning of the storm, before the wind had reached its full fury, Elias had gone down into his small cellar. He had opened the heavy iron door of his firebox and built a single, compact fire of dense, seasoned oak he had saved for this purpose. He did not build a roaring blaze, but a small, intensely hot fire. He let it burn for 3 hours, feeding it carefully, until the oak was reduced to a deep bed of glowing coals. Then he sealed the firebox door and the air intake, choking off the oxygen. The fire was out. He had used a small fraction of the wood a normal stove would consume in the same amount of time. He returned to the room above. There was no immediate dramatic burst of heat. There was only a slow, almost imperceptible change. The floorboards, which had been cold, began to shed their chill. The great central pillar of stone and brick began to radiate a gentle, pervasive warmth. It was not the harsh, dry heat of an iron stove, but a soft, steady presence, like the warmth of the sun on a spring afternoon. The cold was not driven back into the corners. It was simply gone. The entire cabin, from wall to wall, became a sanctuary of calm, even temperature. The storm raged outside. The wind shrieked and battered the walls, but inside there was only a muffled, distant sound. The warmth from the stone mass under the floor and the central pillar created a stable, tranquil environment. Elias sat at his table, calmly carving a small wooden bird for Anna. The shavings fell onto a floor that was warm to the touch. Anna herself was not huddled by a fire. She was playing on the floor in the middle of the room, her movements free and unencumbered by layers of blankets. She was wearing a simple wool dress and was perfectly comfortable. The frost that painted such beautiful, deadly ferns on every other window in Providence Creek did not form on Elias's panes. The air inside was too consistently warm. He had built his house into a stove, and it was working. On the third day of the blizzard, Silas Blackwood faced a crisis. His woodpile was nearly gone. The last of the accessible logs had been burned, and the rest were buried under a 6-foot drift that was as hard as rock. The temperature in his cabin was dropping steadily. The fire was guttering, and soon it would be out. Desperation gnawed at him. He looked at his wife and his shivering children, and a terrible thought entered his mind. He thought of the fool, Elias Brandt. He pictured Elias and his little girl, frozen in their cabin, victims of his insane experiment. In a strange mixture of guilt, fear, and a desperate need to do something, he decided he had to check on them. If they were in trouble, he had to help. If they had already perished, he had to know. He bundled himself in every layer of clothing he owned, pulling his hat down and wrapping a scarf over his face, until only his eyes were visible. He told Mary he was going for more wood, a lie to spare her the added worry. He opened his cabin door and was thrown back by the force of the wind. The world was a white chaos. He pushed his way out, the cold and immediate physical blow that stole his breath. He fought his way through the drifts, stumbling, crawling at times, the snow and wind scouring his exposed skin. The short distance to Elias's cabin, normally a 2-minute walk, became an epic journey. He was guided only by instinct and the faint outline of the roof. He was convinced he was on a fool's errand, a journey to witness a tragedy he had failed to prevent. He finally reached the cabin and fell against the door, his lungs burning, his beard a solid mass of ice. He hammered on the wood with a frozen fist, shouting Elias's name, his voice snatched away by the wind. There was no answer. Fear clenched his heart. He pushed on the door, and to his surprise, it was unlatched. It swung inward, and he stumbled into the room, bringing a whirlwind of snow and frigid air with him. He fell to his knees, gasping, shaking with cold and exertion, his eyes temporarily blinded by the change in light. The first thing he registered was the silence. There was no roaring stove, no crackling fire. The second was the warmth. It was not a blast of heat. It was a gentle, all-encompassing embrace. It was the most shocking sensation he had ever felt. He pushed the snow-caked scarf from his face and looked up. The scene before him was one of impossible, infuriating peace. Elias Brandt was sitting at his table, a book open before him. The little girl, Anna, was asleep on a small cot, covered by a single, light blanket. The air was warm, not hot, not smoky, just warm. A comfortable, even, living warmth. There was no stove. There was no fire. It was impossible. Silas stared, his mind struggling to reconcile what his senses were telling him. He was in a warm room in the middle of the worst blizzard in living memory, and there was no visible source of heat. He looked at Elias, who had risen from his chair, his expression one of mild concern, not triumph. He looked at the sleeping child, her chest rising and falling in the easy rhythm of peaceful sleep. He looked at the bare windows, clear of frost. He put a hand out, as if to touch the air, to verify its substance. "How?" Silas finally whispered, his voice hoarse. It was the only word he could manage. Elias did not boast. He did not say, "I told you so." He simply walked to the small kitchen area, poured a cup of coffee from a pot that was sitting on the warm surface of the central brick pillar, and handed it to Silas. The ceramic mug was warm in Silas's frozen hands. "Sit," Elias said quietly. "You are freezing." Silas stumbled to the table and sank into a chair. He cradled the mug, letting the warmth seep into his fingers. He looked around the room again, his builder's eye searching for the trick, the explanation. He saw nothing. Only the plain wooden walls, the simple furniture, and the massive, silent column of brick in the center of the room. His gaze fell upon it. "The chimney," Silas stammered. "It's warm." He reached out and touched the brick. It was not hot, but radiated a deep, steady heat, like a stone that has been lying in the sun all day. Elias nodded. He then pointed to the floor. The floor, too. Hesitantly, Silas reached down and pressed his palm against the floorboards. They were also warm. It was a miracle. A quiet, inexplicable miracle. His mind reeled. All his knowledge, all his experience, all his pride, crumbled in the face of this impossible reality. He, the master builder, was freezing to death in his perfectly constructed cabin. And this man, this quiet fool he had mocked, was living in gentle comfort. He was wrong. It was a simple, devastating, and liberating realization. He was utterly and completely wrong. "Where is the fire?" Silas asked, his voice filled with a new and unfamiliar humility. Elias walked to the corner of the room and lifted the small iron plate in the floor. A faint, distant glow emanated from the darkness below. There was no smoke, no flame, only the deep red of dying embers. "The fire was this morning," Elias said. "The heat is in the stone. The house is the stove." That simple sentence rearranged the world for Silas Blackwood. The house is the stove. It was the key, the revelation. He had spent his life fighting the cold from the outside, trying to push it back with fire. Elias had invited the warmth into the very bones of his home, making it an ally. Silas sat there for a long time, sipping the coffee, the profound, even warmth of the cabin seeping into his body, thawing not just his frozen limbs, but his frozen certainty. He had come expecting to find a tomb, and instead, he had found the future. The storm raged for another 2 days. Silas stayed with Elias, unable and unwilling to face the journey back. He helped Elias with small chores, watched him care for his daughter, and asked quiet, careful questions. Elias answered them all, explaining the principles of thermal mass, of slow heat release, of capturing every bit of energy from the fuel before letting the smoke escape. He spoke not as a teacher lecturing a student, but as one man sharing knowledge with another. There was no arrogance in him, only a quiet satisfaction that his plan had worked, that his daughter was safe. When the storm finally broke, the world was reborn in a landscape of blinding white and brilliant blue. The silence was as profound as the storm's fury had been. Silas, rested and warm for the first time in days, made the journey back to his own cabin. He found his family huddled together, miserable and cold, the last of their fire having died the day before. He got a new fire started, and as warmth began to creep back into their lives, he told Mary what he had seen. She listened in stunned silence, her eyes wide with disbelief and then dawning wonder. Word spread through Providence Creek like a slow-moving thaw. It began with Silas's story. At first, no one believed him. They thought the cold and the fear had gotten to him. But there was a change in Silas that was undeniable. His usual bluster and pride were gone, replaced by a quiet, thoughtful humility. He urged them, "Go and see. Just go and feel it for yourselves." And so they came. In 2s and 3s, they trudged through the massive drifts to Elias Brandt's cabin. They came expecting to see some trick, some clever deception. They knocked on his door, and he welcomed them all. Each person who stepped across his threshold had the same reaction. First, a shock at the gentle, pervasive warmth. Then, confusion as their eyes searched for the stove that was not there. They would touch the central pillar. They would press their hands to the warm floor. They would look at the clear windows and at the calmly sleeping child. The derisive laughter that had echoed all autumn was replaced by a hushed, reverent silence. They saw that it was not a trick. It was a truth made of stone and clay and wisdom. A few days later, a delegation of the settlement's leading men, led by Silas Blackwood, came to Elias's door. They stood before him, their hats in their hands, their faces a mixture of shame and awe. It was Silas who spoke for them all. "Elias," he began, his voice steady, "we were wrong. We mocked you when we should have listened. We were fools, blinded by our own ways. Your home, it is the warmest place any of us have ever known, and our families are still cold." He paused, and then made the request that would change everything. "Will you teach us?" Elias looked at the faces of the men before him. He saw no hint of their earlier mockery, only a genuine, desperate desire to learn. He saw in their eyes the same fear for their children that had driven him. He nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "I will." And so the education of Providence Creek began. Elias took them, group by group, into his cellar. He showed them the firebox, the intricate, winding channels. He explained how the smoke had to travel a long and difficult path, forcing it to surrender its heat to the stone mass. He drew his diagrams in the dirt again, but this time the men did not kick them away. They knelt, studying the lines, asking questions, their minds racing to grasp the simple, revolutionary principles. He taught them about the importance of mass, about the difference between the quick, fleeting heat of iron and the slow, enduring warmth of stone. He shared his knowledge freely, holding nothing back. He was not a savior or a genius, just a mason who understood his craft. That spring, a new sound filled the air in the settlement. Alongside the familiar ring of the hammer and the rasp of the saw, there was the rhythmic scrape of the shovel. A great digging had begun. Under Silas's guidance, now working as Elias's most dedicated apprentice, the men of the community began to retrofit their homes. They cut holes in their floors, excavated pits, and began the hard work of hauling stone. They built their own fireboxes and heat channels, following the designs Elias had laid out for them. It was a season of communal labor unlike any before. The men worked together, moving from one cabin to the next, sharing the load and the newfound knowledge. The women organized meals for the work crews, and the children played among the growing piles of stone and clay. The project unified them. Their shared mistake transformed into a shared purpose. Elias was at the center of it all, not as a commander, but as a quiet guide. He would move from house to house, inspecting the work, offering a suggestion here, a word of encouragement there. He showed them how to fit the stones, how to mix the mortar, how to shape the flues for the optimal flow of heat. He was patient and tireless. By the time the first chill of the next autumn arrived, nearly every home in Providence Creek had a new heart. The ugly, inefficient iron stoves were dragged out and left to rust behind the barns. In their place stood the solid, silent masonry pillars, and beneath the floors lay the intricate stone labyrinths. The physical landscape of the settlement had changed. The woodpiles were smaller, a third of the size they had been the previous year. The very air seemed cleaner, with less smoke pouring from the chimneys. When the next winter came, it was just as cold and brutal as the last. The wind still howled like a hungry wolf, and the snow still fell in blinding sheets. But inside the homes of Providence Creek, everything was different. A quiet revolution had taken place. Families lived in a gentle, even warmth. Children played freely on warm floors. A single, small fire in the morning was enough to keep a house comfortable for an entire day and night. The frantic, daily war for fuel was over. The cold was still an adversary, but it was no longer a tyrant. It was kept at bay, not by a raging, temporary fire, but by the steady, indomitable warmth of stone. The story of the settlement that had tamed the winter began to travel. Traders and trappers passing through would marvel at the comfort of the cabins and the small woodpiles. They would leave with stories of the ground stoves and the quiet immigrant who had built the first one. The idea spread, carried by word of mouth, from one homestead to the next, across the vast, cold plains. The knowledge Elias had shared took root in the land, a legacy of warmth and wisdom. Elias Brandt never sought credit or praise. He lived out his days in Providence Creek, a respected but still quiet member of the community. He watched his daughter grow up healthy and strong, in a home that was always safe and warm. His greatest satisfaction came not from the vindication of his idea, but from the simple sight of smoke rising from the chimneys of his neighbors on a cold morning, knowing that inside, their children were as warm as his own. He had faced the ghost of a tragic winter, and had not just defeated it for himself, but had given an entire community the knowledge to do the same. The legacy of his work was not just in the stones he had laid, but in the lesson he had taught. It was a lesson in humility, a reminder that the old ways are not always the best ways, and that true wisdom can sometimes be found in the quietest voices. It proved that one person's patient observation and courage to defy convention could transform the lives of many. The people of Providence Creek learned that the harshest elements can be met not with brute force, but with intelligent design, and that sometimes the most powerful solutions are not built up in a great roaring blaze, but are laid down slowly, carefully, and silently, deep in the earth.